My name is Barbara Whitmore. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life, I worked as an accountant by day and a cleaner by night. Numbers by daylight, floors and windows by moonlight. I raised my son David with the belief that every sacrifice I made would one day be honored, that my hard work and dignity would count for something. I thought at the very least I had earned the right to be called his mother. But under the bright chandeliers of Maplewood Banquet Hall, in front of 200 guests, I was introduced as nothing more than a house cleaner. The microphone hissed slightly as David's voice carried across the room. He stood tall, pride shining in his champagne-flushed cheeks. With one arm wrapped around Alice, my ex-husband's girlfriend dressed in shimmering silver, he declared, "This woman here is my real mother. She has been the guiding light of my life." The guests clapped, raising their glasses. Then his eyes shifted to me, and with a smirk, he added, "And this is Barbara. She helps around the house. She keeps the place clean." Laughter rippled through the tables like a cruel wave. Champagne glasses clinked. Cameras flashed to capture the moment. But all I could hear was the dull roar in my ears, like the ocean pulling me under. My hand shot up to my neck to the scarf I always wore, hiding the scar left from thyroid cancer surgery. That scar was proof of survival, proof of nights when I worked 2 jobs while swallowing bitter pills, proof of the years I fought both illness and loneliness. Yet here I stood erased by my own son in a single sentence. I had paid $150,000 for that wedding. Every check was signed with my name: $20,000 for the banquet hall, $15,000 for the band, $6,000 for flowers that would wilt by morning, $30,000 for catering that I never tasted. I thought my son would look at me that night with gratitude. Instead, he looked right through me. The smell of roasted beef mixed with sweet champagne clung to the air. A woman in a sequined gown whispered to her neighbor, her eyes darting toward me. I could not hear her words, but I knew the look. Pity, curiosity, maybe even contempt. My ex-husband Charles sat at the head table with a glass of wine, smiling thinly, as if the scene before him was a performance he had directed. Alice dabbed the corner of her eyes with a napkin, pretending to cry, soaking in applause that was meant for me. And David, my boy, he laughed, clapping his hands, oblivious to the knife he had just driven into my chest. This was the same child I once carried through fevers at night, rocking him in a chair until dawn, while my own body begged for sleep. The same child whose homework I stayed up to check, even when my bones ached from mopping floors in an office building past midnight. The same child I once fed with the last dollar in my purse. While I went hungry, I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, "I am your mother." I wanted to list every bill, every scar, every meal skipped, every prayer whispered for him when I was too weak to stand. I wanted to tear down the facade of this wedding and expose the truth. But I did not. I chose silence. Not because I was weak, but because silence can slice sharper than words. Silence can echo longer than applause. Silence is a strategy, one that requires patience, one that waits for its moment. I folded my napkin carefully, placed it on the table, and pushed my chair back. My legs felt heavy, but I forced them to move. The music played on, upbeat and oblivious, but to me it sounded like a dirge. I walked between the tables, past the polished tuxedos and glittering gowns, past the stares that burned into my back. I did not make a scene. I did not cry. I simply left. As I reached the door, I heard a voice, soft female whisper behind me. Why didn't she fight back? The question hung in the air unanswered, and I carried it with me like a stone. The night outside was cold, biting into my skin. I fumbled for my car keys, but my hands trembled so badly they slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the asphalt. For a moment, I leaned against the car chest, heaving, every muscle shaking. The image of my son calling another woman his real mother seared into my mind. I felt as though the ground itself might open beneath me. Then I pressed my hand to the scarf at my neck. I felt the rough line of the scar beneath the fabric. That scar was not a mark of weakness. It was a testament to survival. It steadied me. My breath slowed. My hand stopped shaking. I bent down, picked up the keys, and stared into the darkness of the parking lot. If my son wanted to call me a house cleaner, then I would stop carrying him as my son. If he wanted to erase me with words, then I would erase the foundation beneath his feet with papers. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the hall. The lights of the banquet hall glowed in my rearview mirror like a cruel mirage. I did not look back. I left in silence. But what I did next would shake his world. The drive home from the wedding felt endless, though the hall was only 12 miles from my house. The glow of the banquet lights followed me in the rearview mirror, a reminder of the humiliation I had just endured. My hand stayed tight on the wheel knuckles, white as if gripping the steering wheel could stop my heart from breaking. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the silence of the empty house greeted me like an old friend. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark. That whisper from the wedding hall replayed in my mind. Why didn't she fight back? I wanted to answer, but my throat was locked. Fighting back with words in that moment would have been wasted breath. My revenge would not be loud. It would be patient. But before I could decide on the road ahead, my mind drifted backward to the long years that had shaped me to the scars that had marked my body and my soul. I remember the first year after Charles left. David was 9 years old. We had no savings, no second income, no safety net. I worked as an accountant during the day, balancing spreadsheets for a company that would never promote me beyond middle management. At night, I put on rubber gloves and scrubbed the floors of office buildings, breathing in the sharp smell of bleach, praying the chemicals would not trigger another coughing fit. Some nights I would bring David along. He would sit in the corner of the office lobby with his school books spread out on a folding chair, his little legs swinging above the ground. "Mom, I finished my math," he would whisper proudly, showing me the pages. My knees ached from kneeling, but I would crouch beside him, double-checking each answer, praising him softly. Then I would stand and keep mopping until my arms felt like they belonged to someone else. Money was always short. There were months when I had to choose between paying the electricity bill or buying groceries. I often skipped meals, telling David I had already eaten at work. He believed me, and I let him believe, because the glow on his face when he had enough to eat was worth the hunger gnawing in my own stomach. When the doctor diagnosed me with thyroid cancer, I kept the news from David for weeks. He was only 12 then, too young to carry the weight of my illness. I went through surgery with Charles, nowhere to be found. The incision on my neck healed into a thick scar, one I tried to cover with scarves and high collars. But it was never the scar that embarrassed me. It was the reminder of how alone I had been, and how much I had carried on my own shoulders. The radiation treatments drained me, but I still went to work. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out like weapons aimed at me. Hospital charges, rent, tuition fees, groceries. My paycheck was never enough, but I always found a way. I cleaned extra houses on weekends. I borrowed against credit cards. I swallowed pride like bitter medicine. And through it all, David was my reason. Every late night, every skipped meal, every aching bone, it was all for him. One night after I had tucked him into bed, I found a folded piece of paper under my pillow. It was written in his uneven, childish handwriting. "Mom, you're my hero." The words were shaky, the ink smudged, but they glowed brighter than any diamond could. I pressed that note against my chest and cried silently into the dark. I kept that letter. For decades, I kept it. Through every eviction notice we narrowly avoided. Through every phone call from debt collectors. Through every birthday I could not afford a proper cake. That note reminded me why I endured. It reminded me that my son saw me, that he understood even if the rest of the world never would. And now, after everything, the same boy who once called me his hero had stood before a banquet hall and erased me with a smile. He called Alice his real mother. He called me a cleaner. The letter was still in my dresser drawer, folded so many times it was wearing thin. But the boy who wrote it, where had he gone? I walked upstairs that night after the wedding, each step heavier than the last. In my bedroom, I opened the top drawer of my dresser. The familiar smell of cedar drifted up. Beneath scarves and old photographs, I found the envelope. My hands shook as I pulled it out. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still there. "Mom, you're my hero." I sat on the edge of my bed, the house silent around me, and held that letter to my chest once again. Tears blurred the words, but I knew them by heart. My heart ached with the memory of that little boy, eyes wide with admiration, believing I was strong enough to conquer anything. I have always believed that money in its purest form was meant to protect the people you love. A roof over their heads, food on the table, tuition bills covered before collectors could come knocking. Money to me was never about luxury. It was about survival. But the wedding changed that. For the first time in my life, I saw money being twisted into something else, a performance, a mask, a weapon. I kept every receipt, every canceled check with the bank's blue stamp pressed on its face. January 12, 2023, check number 1184, $20,000 to Maplewood Banquet Hall as a deposit. February 6, 2023, check number 1191, $15,000 to Elegance Events and Catering, the ones who promised duck confit and lobster tails that would make the bride's family feel important. March 2nd, 2023, check number 1203, $6,200 to Orchid Floral Design for Flowers. I would never smell that would wilt before dawn. I remember signing each check at my kitchen table. The wood is scratched and faded from years of use, but I would spread the bills out neatly, write carefully, and tuck the carbon copy into a file. For David, I would whisper to myself, for his happiness. My hands often trembled, sometimes from exhaustion, sometimes from the side effects of medication, sometimes from the fear that I was bleeding my own future dry. But I signed anyway. The biggest check of all was dated April 10, 2023. Check number 1217. $30,000 to Starlight Entertainment Group for a band David said he couldn't live without. Mom, it's the soundtrack to our lives, he insisted. I didn't argue. I wrote the check even as my retirement fund shrank to a shadow of itself. And then came the smaller but relentless expenses. Suit fittings at Harrington's, $3,600. Invitations printed on embossed ivory paper, $4,200. A photographer with a glossy magazine portfolio, $10,000 upfront. Even the cake, a 7-tiered monstrosity designed more for spectacle than taste, cost me $5,200. By the time June rolled around, I had written checks totaling $150,000. $150,000. The numbers seared into my brain like an iron brand. Money I had earned through decades of double shifts and lonely nights. Money that should have been the cushion of my old age, the safety net. After years of carrying others, I told myself it was worth it. I told myself that no mother should walk into her son's wedding with anything less than her head high, knowing she had given him the best. I told myself love demanded sacrifice. But as the months passed, I began to notice something unsettling. The more money I gave, the less voice I had. When I asked about the playlist, David said Alice already handled it. When I asked about the flowers, the bride's mother smiled politely and said, Alice thought roses would be best. When I asked if I could be part of the food tasting, David shifted uncomfortably. Mom, it'll just be simpler this way. Simpler. That word hit me like a stone. Simpler meant without me. The guest list was finalized without my input. The seating chart circulated in group emails I wasn't copied on. When I finally saw the plan, my name was missing from the head table. Why am I not listed here? I asked, careful to keep my tone light. David cleared his throat, eyes darting away. Mom, it will confuse people. Confuse people. I sat in silence, staring at him, the pen still in my hand from signing yet another check. Confuse people, as if my very existence was a riddle he couldn't explain. As if the woman who raised him, fed him, and nearly starved to keep him alive would somehow embarrass him in front of his bride's family. That moment cracked something deep inside me. For years I believed love could be proven by sacrifice. That the more you gave, the more solid your place became in someone's life. But here I was, $150,000 lighter, and suddenly erased. It forced me to ask the question out loud, one that I knew would spark debate far beyond my own kitchen walls. Can love be measured in money? I thought about all the mothers working double shifts at diners, scrubbing hotel bathrooms, folding clothes in laundromats. They sacrifice silently, believing their children will remember. But what if the children only remember the shine of someone else's smile? What if money doesn't buy respect, only temporary gratitude, that fades as quickly as flowers at a banquet? I thought of the letter David wrote me when he was small. Mom, you're my hero. That letter never mentioned money. It never mentioned brand-name suits or 7-tier cakes. It spoke of presents, of sacrifice, of love. And yet somehow in adulthood, he had equated worth with glamour, with appearances, with what Alice could provide in polish, rather than what I had provided in sweat and scars. As June 24th approached the wedding date, I felt like an outsider funding a show I wasn't invited to star in. I stood in line at the bank one Friday morning, depositing my paycheck. The teller glanced at the balance and gave me a look I knew too well. Pity. My account was nearly drained, and yet my son's wedding would sparkle like royalty. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the fool. Was I buying my son's love, thinking the receipt of $150,000 would guarantee me a seat at his side? Or had I been tricked into thinking sacrifice was the same as honor when the invitations arrived? Embossed and shimmering, my name appeared near the bottom in small print beneath family contributions. Contributions. Not mother, not matriarch. Just contributions. The night before the wedding, I ironed my only good dress and wrapped my scar with a silk scarf. I looked in the mirror and whispered, "Tomorrow he will see me." But deep down, I knew better. Tomorrow the world would see what my son wanted them to see. And when I asked one last time if I could sit near him at the reception, his answer sliced through me sharper than any knife. "Mom," he said quietly, almost apologetically, "it will confuse people." The music inside the banquet hall was still rattling through the walls when I slipped out into the night air. The door closed behind me with a heavy click, muffling the laughter and applause that had followed David's speech. Out here, the parking lot was almost empty, only a few cars gleaming under the harsh orange glow of the lamps. My heels clicked against the pavement as I walked, every step dragging with a weight that had nothing to do with the fabric of my dress. I reached my car and fumbled for the keys. My hands would not stop shaking. They trembled the way they had trembled when I signed those checks, the way they had trembled when the surgeon drew a line across my neck years ago. The keys slipped clattering to the asphalt. The sound echoed in the emptiness of the lot, sharp and humiliating, like the applause I had just walked away from. I bent to pick them up, and for a moment the world blurred. My scarf brushed against my scar, a reminder of every battle I had fought alone. My breath came shallow, ragged. This was not just exhaustion. It was grief, twisting into something harder, something with edges. As I straightened, I noticed movement at the far end of the lot. A young catering worker was dragging a bin of trash bags toward the dumpster. He couldn't have been more than 19. His black apron was smeared with grease, his hands red from hot dishwater. Our eyes met. He froze just for a second, then looked down quickly as if embarrassed to have seen too much. But I saw it, pity, yes, but also recognition. He knew what it felt like to serve silently, to work until your hands cracked, only to vanish when the applause began. In him I saw myself at his age, bent, unnoticed, but alive. I gripped the steering wheel when I slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cold under my palms. My reflection in the rearview mirror startled me, the scarf around my neck, the tear tracks on my cheeks, the haunted look in my eyes. It was the face of a woman who had carried too much, too long. Inside, the music swelled again. A cheer went up, followed by a burst of clinking glasses. Perhaps they were toasting Alice, the real mother. Perhaps they were laughing at a joke I had become. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life, but my hand still trembled on the gear shift. I pressed it down hard until my knuckles burned white. On the drive home, the city lights smeared against the windshield like streaks of paint. My body moved on instinct, steering, braking, turning, but my mind was elsewhere. Each block carried me deeper into silence. The applause was gone, replaced by the hum of the engine and the roar of my own heartbeat. I replayed every detail: the checks, the meals skipped, the letter tucked under his pillow, the scar hidden beneath scarves. I had carried David as a boy, carried him through hunger and sickness, carried him into manhood. And tonight he had carried me into a room full of strangers and set me down as if I were a piece of disposable furniture. When the light turned red, I stopped at the intersection and let my head fall against the steering wheel. The horn blared faintly, then died. My shoulders shook, but no sound came out. This was not the sobbing of weakness. This was the tremor of something being born inside me. I pulled into my driveway at last. The house looked small, almost fragile, with its peeling paint and crooked shutters. Yet it was mine, the only fortress I had left. I parked, killed the engine, and sat there listening to the tick of cooling metal. My keys slipped again from my fingers, landing between the seats. I let them stay there. In the silence, I thought of the boy with the bin of trash. The way he had looked at me, quiet, almost apologetic. He had reminded me that there was honor in labor, but only if it was recognized. My mistake had been carrying David without ever asking him to carry me in return. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope that held his wedding invitation. The paper was embossed, heavy, smug with expense. I tore it in half, then in half again, until the pieces fluttered like confetti onto the passenger seat. My chest rose with a deep, steady breath. I whispered to myself, this silence will be my weapon. I opened the door and stepped into the night air. The sky above was starless, a sheet of black. The neighborhood was quiet, save for a dog barking in the distance. My feet crunched against the gravel as I walked to the porch. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to turn on the light. Darkness suited me. Inside, I sank into the chair by the window. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. I pressed my hands together, still trembling, and closed my eyes. For decades, I had lived for David. My body bore the scars, my bank account bore the wounds, and my spirit bore the weight. But that night, in the silence of my own home, I made a vow. Not to fight, not to scream, not to beg. My revenge would be deliberate. It would be signed in ink, sealed with stamps filed in drawers that carried more power than applause. The boy at the dumpster had looked at me and seen a servant. My son had looked at me and seen the same. But I would teach them what they had forgotten. I would teach them that silence can cut deeper than any shout. The key still lay wedged between the seats of the car outside. Perhaps I would leave them there for a while. I had carried enough for one lifetime. And as the clock ticked softly on the wall, I whispered the words that would carry me into the days ahead. Words no one else could hear but me. I will stop carrying him as my son. The first night after the wedding, I barely slept. I lay awake in the silence of my house, staring at the ceiling, my body heavy as stone, but my mind burning like fire. Somewhere in the city, David and Alice were likely still celebrating, still glowing under chandeliers I had paid for. But here in the darkness, I was done mourning. By morning, I pulled the heavy file box from under my bed. Dust coated its lid, the kind that gathers after years of neglect. Inside were decades of paper, each sheet a fragment of my life as a worker, a mother, a survivor. Pay stubs from the hospital laundry, bank slips, tax filings, utility bills written in my careful script, and most importantly, carbon copies of the checks I had written for David's wedding. I carried the box to the dining table. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, slicing the room into bars of golden shadow. I switched on the desk lamp, the one I used for balancing bills. Its glow spilled across the table, catching on the stack of papers. The reflection glimmered faintly on the silk scarf draped around my neck, then bent across the scar beneath. That scar, once a mark of shame, seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the pile before me. Survival on one side, strategy on the other. I began sorting, one stack for the checks with dates, numbers, and stamps, another for receipts from vendors, another for legal documents, the deed to my house still in my name, and the retirement accounts I had not yet drained. Page after page piled up the stack, growing thick, heavier than any weapon I could carry in my hands. There is power in silence, yes, but silence without paper is only a whisper. Paper speaks, paper convicts. Paper transfers power from one hand to another without a single word spoken. As I worked, the phone buzzed. I didn't answer at first, but when it rang again, I picked up. It was David's voice, casual, as though nothing had happened. Mom, Alice wanted me to check, can we stay at your house for a while? Just until we figure out the mortgage. My grip tightened around the phone. I could hear Alice in the background, her voice high and sharp. Then David added, almost as an afterthought, you know Alice is pregnant. We'll need more space. Pregnant. The word struck like lightning, setting my resolve against my compassion. My chest ached. I thought of that child, my grandchild, growing inside a woman who had erased me with a smile, who had stood in silk while I was introduced as the cleaner. I thought of a baby born into a house I had built under a roof I had kept patched with sweat and money. The moral weight nearly crushed me. Could I throw them out? Could I deny a roof to my own blood? Or would that baby be safer if I acted now before it learned from parents who had built their lives on lies and cruelty? I closed my eyes. My mind returned to every night I had skipped dinner so David could eat, every time I had worked double shifts, so he would have clean shoes, every moment I had carried his future on my back. And now he was asking me to carry him again under the guise of carrying his child. But the box of papers sat in front of me, glowing under the lamp. I touched the edge of the deed, cool and crisp. No matter what my heart said, the ink spoke louder. Property rights, account numbers, payment records. They were mine. I whispered into the receiver, voice steady. Not this time, David. There was silence on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. Mom, you don't mean that. You can't put us out. She's pregnant. I heard you the first time I said. My eyes fixed on the scar's reflection in the lamp's glow. But my house is not a womb for your irresponsibility. Papers don't bend for pity. He cursed a sound I had never thought I would hear from him. Then the line went dead. I set the phone down and let the silence return. My hands shook, but not from weakness. From resolve. The moral conflict tore at me, yes, but beneath it surged something older, fiercer, the instinct to finally protect myself. I stayed at the table all day building a fortress of paper. Vendor receipts stapled. Bank slips clipped. The house deed sealed in a plastic cover. Every document became a stone in the wall between me and the weight I had carried for too long. At dusk, I lit a single candle on the table. The flame wavered and the shadows danced across the piles, making them look taller, stronger. My scarf slipped slightly, exposing the scar. I didn't hide it this time. I let the flame reflect against it, against the curve of my neck, against the papers that would define the next battle. I leaned closer, whispering words meant only for myself, words the world would one day hear in a different form. This scar is not weakness. It is proof. The morning after my decision, I drove downtown with the box of papers, riding shotgun. The courthouse stood tall, its gray stone columns worn from decades of footsteps like mine, ordinary people, seeking extraordinary justice. I had walked those steps before, once to file divorce papers against Charles, and once to finalize the deed to this very house. Today I walked them again, carrying silence as my armor and paper as my sword. Inside, the clerk barely looked up when I slid the documents across the counter. Eviction papers, I said firmly. My voice did not tremble. She flipped through the pages, checked the deed, stamped the forms. The echo of her rubber stamp felt louder than any gavel. 30 days. That was the law. 30 days to vacate, or the sheriff would escort them out. As I signed my name, Barbara Whitmore, the pen moved steadily without pause. My scar brushed against my collar as I leaned down, and for the first time I did not feel ashamed. I felt aligned with the ink. When I returned home, the envelope of official papers felt heavy in my purse. Heavy but righteous. I set them on the dining table beside the candle stub from the night before. The flame was gone, but its waxy shadow reminded me that fire could be rekindled. That evening David arrived. Alice followed, one hand resting protectively on her small belly. I caught my breath at the sight. The faint swell was barely visible, but it was there. Proof of life tangled with proof of betrayal. David's voice cracked as he spoke. "Mom, what is this?" He held the papers like they were poison. "You want to throw us out? Alice is pregnant." I met his eyes without blinking. "These are eviction papers. You have 30 days. Alice stepped forward, her tone sharp but trembling. "What kind of mother does this? What kind of grandmother?" Her hand tightened against her belly, as if shielding the child from me. The question cut deep, not because it was true, but because it echoed the very conflict burning inside me. I thought of every mother who had sacrificed everything only to be erased. I thought of the boy at the dumpster, invisible, yet carrying the world's waste. And I thought of the unborn child, innocent, but tied to parents who mocked the very woman who gave them everything. "This is not cruelty," I said quietly. "This is consequence." David slammed his fist on the table. "You're heartless. She's carrying your grandchild." The words hung in the air like smoke. I turned them over in my mind. Grandchild. Blood of my blood. But what does compassion mean when it demands you destroy yourself to provide it? Does compassion still count when it becomes a chain around your neck? Or must compassion sometimes come with conditions, boundaries, lines that even love cannot cross? Society praises unconditional mothers, women who give until there is nothing left. But who praises the woman who finally says enough? Who honors the mother who protects herself even when the world calls her cold? I reached for the papers. My fingers brushed the thick edges, steady and deliberate. The law gives you 30 days. I will honor that, but I will not carry you past it. Alice's eyes filled with tears, though. Whether from shame or strategy, I could not tell. David looked at me with fury, his face twisted. But beneath it I saw a flicker of something else, fear. Fear that the fortress he had built on my sacrifice was finally crumbling. I let the silence stretch heavy as stone. Then I spoke the words that would anchor the days to come. Words that would both wound and protect, words that even I would wrestle with in the nights ahead. You may stay until the baby comes. The house settled into a new rhythm after the eviction notice. Morning coffee tasted like resolve. The same rooms I had once cleaned for other people now held my plans. I kept the papers organized, each stack a small tribunal on my dining table. Receipts, canceled checks, vendor invoices, bank statements, mortgage records. Everything I had used to keep a roof over our heads became the bones of a case I intended to build. Revenge was never meant to be loud for me. I had seen loud revenge on television, shouting matches, broken dishes scenes that pleased a crowd for 5 minutes and then faded. That was not my way. I am neither dramatist nor spectacle. I am steady, I am deliberate. I had learned in years of balancing ledgers and scrubbing floors that the quiet things hold more power than 1,000 angry words. I made a list. Step 1, secure all legal paperwork for the house mortgage and any joint accounts that tied me to their comfort. Step 2, document every payment I had made for the wedding with checks and carbon copies. Step 3, verify names and signatures on every form I could find. Paper is honest when people are not. Paper does not smile and pretend. Days turned into a slow, efficient machine. I called the bank and requested copies of statements going back 5 years. I requested certified copies of the deed from the county recorder's office. I organized vendor invoices by date and paid the small fees to get notarized copies. Each trip to an office felt like a small victory. Each stamp and signature felt like a quiet bell ringing in a town square only I could hear. In the evenings, I sat with my papers under the lamp. The light caught the silver weave of my scarf and reflected off the scar at the base of my throat. For the first time those years, my scar read like a ledger entry, a mark of survival that matched the columns of numbers before me. I began to understand how power could be transferred on paper, how a deed and a signature could rearrange a life with the same finality as any shout. People started to notice, or at least to sense, that I had changed. The boy from the catering crew nodded to me in the grocery aisle the first week after the eviction was filed. A neighbor left a casserole on my porch with a post-it, "Thinking of you." These were small things, but they stitched me back together in ways money alone could not. But my work was not only about my house. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, I began to withdraw financial supports that had long kept David and Charles afloat. I closed a safety account I had quietly maintained for my son. It had started as an emergency fund when he was young, a place I dropped small amounts when I could. Over years, it became habit for him to lean on it. I called the credit card companies where I had co-signed and revoked my authorization where legally possible. I stopped making the quiet payments on the car insurance and student loans I had absorbed without complaint. You would think these moves would cause immediate chaos. They did. There were late notices, frantic phone calls in the night, the kind of panic that sounds like a storm at sea. I read the messages and did not flinch. The market of dependence is fragile. Remove the anchors and the ship lists. I was unanchoring them one by one. Still, quiet revenge has limits if you do not pair it with evidence that cannot be disputed. That was why the checks mattered. That was why the county recorder's copies mattered. That was why I had a lawyer friend, a woman named Gloria, who owed me a favor from years ago when I doctored her tax paperwork at the office, so she could keep a small home she'd bought before the economy crashed. I did not use her influence. I used her legal mind. Gloria read the stacks with a patient, exacting eye. She showed me how to present everything in a way that made the truth unavoidable. You have the receipts, she said on our first meeting at her kitchen table. You have canceled checks. You have a clear chain of payments. A judge will look at your file, and the math will speak for itself. She did not say revenge. She said justice. There is a difference. With Gloria's help, I prepared a packet, a neat, heavy packet with tabs and color-coded evidence. I copied bank deposit slips next to the carbon copies of the checks. I flagged transactions that showed a pattern of financial caretaking. I annotated vendor invoices with dates and check numbers. I wrote a clear chronology starting with small repairs after Charles left and ending with the final payment for the cake. One evening, as I cross-referenced statements, a particular entry caught my eye. It was an old bank letter, a notice from when Charles had supposedly settled a small debt 5 years ago. The letter referenced a 1099 form and a transfer that should have been from Charles with his signature at the bottom. I leaned in. The signature looked familiar in a way that prickled my skin. I had seen that slant before, not in Charles's handwriting, but in the handwriting of the woman who now polished silver at our family dinners. Alice. My fingers moved on their own. I pulled the file labeled Old Correspondence and rifled through until I found the original copy of the 1099. The signature at the bottom was not Charles's rounded cursive. It had a tight loop on the G, a particular kink on the lowercase s, that matched the small sticky note Alice had once scrawled on at our kitchen counter. I felt coldness spread like ink through my veins. If Alice had signed documents in his name, why to hide debt, maybe? To move money out of sight, perhaps? Or to give the impression of support when there was none? The implications were vast. If her name appeared on financial documents, then she was not only the costume in this play. She had been a player in the ledger itself. That meant more than humiliation. That meant liability. I picked up the phone and dialed Gloria, hands steady for the first time in days. She forged a signature, I said when she answered, quiet but clear. There was a pause, and then Gloria's voice sharpened. Get me copies. Seal everything. Do not touch the originals. This could turn the entire conversation about moral failure into a legal one about fraud. Fraud. The word landed with a weight I had not expected. It threw open a new doorway. My quiet revenge had been patient and precise, but the discovery of falsified signatures elevated the fight from private hurt to something the law could not ignore. That night I sat at my table until the streetlights went out. The stack of papers glowed in the lamplight like a small city of proof. I traced the edge of the bank letter with one fingernail and felt the serrated paper like the teeth of a trap closing in. The quiet was different then. It was not merely a strategy. It felt like inevitability. I turned the page and found tucked between two invoices a small envelope I had not remembered opening. Inside was a bank letter addressed to Charles, detailing an old tax form and noting a discrepancy. At the bottom in ink that had bled slightly around the loop was a signature. I held the paper up to the lamp and read the lines once more. Then I placed it on top of the packet where it gleamed like an accusation. Tomorrow I would call the bank. Tomorrow I would ask for an audit. Tonight I would let the silence hold its breath with me listening to the small cathedral of paper at my hands. The papers had spoken louder than any protest I once might have made. And tucked at the very corner of that bank letter, nearly invisible if you did not look, was a small notation. Someone had circled a single letter in the signature and written in a hurried hand 3 letters that made my blood run cold. F-O-G-E-D. The letter with the forged signature lay on my table like a loaded weapon. I had turned it over a dozen times, running my finger across the ink that had bled into the paper. Charles's name was printed neatly, but the hand that wrote it was not his. I had lived beside that handwriting for years, paid bills he signed, read notes he left on the refrigerator. This one was wrong. I knew whose it was. Alice. Her handwriting had that same impatient slant, the loop on the G that never quite closed the hurried curve on the S. It was not an accident, not a coincidence. She had signed her name as his on a legal form that carried tax implications. A 1099. To cover what debt misused funds, or to polish the image of a man who could not manage his own accounts, I stared at the document under the lamp. The scar at my neck caught the same light, a reminder of what survival looks like etched into skin. Silence had always been my shield, but this was different. This was evidence. When I showed Gloria, she didn't even blink. This is forgery, she said. If you press this, Barbara, it won't just humiliate them. It could expose them to criminal liability, tax fraud, fraudulent conveyance. You need to decide, are you ready to carry this to court? Her words shook something in me. Court. The word felt heavy not because I feared it, but because I knew its power. Courtrooms are theaters where paper becomes speech, where judges listen to ink more than to tears. I had lived years where my tears meant nothing, perhaps now the ink would. But before any gavel could strike, the fracture in their perfect facade widened. I drove past Charles's house one evening, a home I once helped pay the down payment on. The curtains were drawn, but the porch light was out. I saw Alice's car missing from the driveway. Rumors travel fast in small neighborhoods, and by the next day I heard it, Alice had left. She had taken her suitcase, her jewelry, and her polished smile. She had left Charles behind with debts, with bills stacked like tombstones on the counter. She loved his shine, one neighbor whispered, not his shadow. I almost laughed when I heard it. The same words had been carved in me years earlier when Charles left me for her. He wanted her shine. Now she wanted none of his shadow. But for David, the consequences were sharper. He came pounding on my door one Sunday afternoon, eyes wild, hair uncombed. "Mom," he said, shoving the bank letter at me, "where did you get this? This isn't what it looks like." "It looks like forgery," I said evenly. His jaw tightened. "Alice did it for Dad, to protect him. From what I asked, the truth." He swallowed, unable to answer. His hands shook as he held the paper, but it was not from guilt. It was from fear. He finally realized that paper does not just record, it exposes. He slammed the document down. "If you take this to court, Barbara, you'll ruin us all." The knock came just after dusk. I had been sitting by the lamp sorting papers once again when the sound startled me. It was not the sharp, impatient knock of a delivery man, nor the polite tap of a neighbor. It was heavy, desperate, a fist that carried both fear and need. When I opened the door, David stood on my porch. His face was gaunt, eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, the image of a man unraveling. Behind him, the streetlight hummed, casting his shadow long across my threshold. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, we need to talk." I didn't answer immediately. The last time he stood in front of me, his words had been weapons, calling me the house cleaner at his wedding siding, with Alice's illusions tearing away my dignity in front of strangers. Now he was shaking, and for a moment the little boy he once was peeked through the man he had become. He stepped closer. "Alice is gone. Dad. He's drinking again. Everything's falling apart. I don't know what to do." His eyes brimmed. "I know I've failed you, but you're the only one left." I let the silence stretch, not cruelly, but because silence can sometimes reveal more than speech. He mistook it as rejection. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time I saw him small again. I reached into the drawer of the hall table and pulled out a yellowed envelope. I had kept it hidden for decades, folded carefully among my most private things. My hand trembled as I handed it to him. He frowned. "What is this, Reed?" I said. He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the childish scrawl. "Mom, you're my hero. When I grow up, I want to be like you." He froze. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears welled and slid down his cheeks. "I wrote this," he whispered. "Yes," I answered softly. "You did. You were 8 years old. And I believed it. I carried it through nights when I worked 2 jobs. Through mornings when I skipped meals so you could eat. Through years when your father turned his back. That letter was my fuel." His hand shook, clutching the paper as if it might vanish. "I don't remember writing it." "I do," I said. "I remembered every word, even when you forgot." He dropped his gaze. The paper trembled between us, the weight of innocence colliding with the wreckage of choices. This was the moment of conflict society often avoids, the question no one wants to answer. Should a mother betrayed and humiliated still open her arms? Should she let the ache of blood ties outweigh the dignity she fought to reclaim? Or should she hold the line, teaching her child that love without boundaries is not love, but slavery? He stepped forward, voice pleading. "Can't we start again? Can't you forgive me?" I swallowed. My body ached to embrace him, to pull him back into the safety of motherhood. But the scar at my throat burned, reminding me of what unconditional surrender had cost me. "Forgiveness is possible," I said. "But trust, that has to be rebuilt. You chose to side with lies. You broke what was sacred. You can't just walk back in and erase it." His face crumpled. "Then what do you want me to do?" "I want you to remember that letter," I said, pointing to the page in his hands. "Not just as a child's promise, but as a man's responsibility. You once called me your hero. Prove it. Live in a way that makes those words true again." He blinked rapidly, breathing shallow. The streetlight flickered, painting us in a harsh glow. "This is your chance," I added quietly. "Not my gift. Your chance." For a moment he looked as if he might collapse onto the porch. His shoulders heaved, the letter shaking in his grip. He opened his mouth again, but words failed him. I stepped back into the doorway. The choice was his now, not mine. I had returned the memory, the proof of love he once declared. Whether he would honor it or discard it again was no longer in my hands. "Mom," he began, desperation raw in his tone, but I gently closed the door. The sound of wood meeting frame echoed through the hallway, final, yet not cruel. It was not the slam of anger, but the close of a chapter. And in that silence, I heard both the ache of distance and the whisper of healing. When the dust settled, I found myself staring at the same dining table where the papers had once towered. But the stacks were gone. The folders, the carbon copies, the legal letters, they had all been sealed, filed, and handed over to those who would carry them forward. My hands were empty for the first time in years, and in that emptiness, I found space for something new. I thought often about what healing should look like. Was it merely the absence of pain, or was it the creation of something better in its place? Silence had been my weapon, but now I wanted silence to become my garden. One morning, I walked into the local community center with a folder tucked under my arm, not of debts or forged signatures, but of plans. Inside was the proposal for a small foundation seeded with what I had reclaimed: the Whitmore Fund for Single Mothers, a grant that would cover school books, utility bills, emergency rent. Nothing grand, nothing headline-worthy, but steady like the woman I had always been. When the director asked why, I answered simply, because no one should feel invisible for doing the hardest work. She nodded, and I saw recognition in her eyes. That same recognition I had craved at the wedding, but never received from my son. This time it came not from blood, but from a stranger who understood. And somehow that was enough. Weeks turned into a rhythm again. I no longer sorted papers at night. Instead, I attended the Tuesday dance class at the same center. The first evening, I lingered at the door scarf, wrapped tight, fingers tugging at the edge. I almost turned back, but the music inside, a gentle waltz, notes lifting like breath, pulled me forward. I stepped onto the floor. My body was stiff at first, unused to grace, but the instructor smiled and held out his hand. I let the scarf slip. It slid down my shoulders, and the cool air touched the scar that had defined me for so long. For the first time, I did not hide it. I let it gleam in the low light, a mark not of shame, but of endurance. As I turned, as my feet found the rhythm, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was older, scarred, imperfect, but she was smiling, truly smiling. Healing did not come as thunder. It came as small steps, as hands reaching, as laughter that replaced bitterness. It came as children's letters pinned on bulletin boards at the center, thanking a fund they had never seen. It came as nights when I came home, hung up my scarf, and poured tea in silence, not as a shield, but as peace. I know people will ask about the scar, as they always have, some with pity, some with curiosity. But now I have an answer that belongs entirely to me. This scar is not weakness. It is proof that I survived, proof that I endured, proof that I reclaimed everything they tried to erase. And with that, I keep dancing. When I look back now, I understand that revenge was never the final chapter. Justice was necessary, but healing was the true destination. The papers spoke, the money returned, the house reclaimed, but the deeper victory was finding peace in myself. I want you to remember this. Scars are not marks of shame. They are proof of survival. Proof that we endured even when the world tried to erase us. Proof that we can rebuild with dignity. As I continue my days, I choose to invest my strength not in bitterness, but in growth. Through the fund I started, through the dance steps I now take without fear. I know that my story has turned into more than pain. It has become a quiet testimony that life can begin again at any age. And now I want to turn to you. Have you ever carried a scar, visible or invisible, that shaped who you are? Do you believe silence can be strength, or do you think confrontation is the only path? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they remind me we are not alone in our journeys. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support brings these stories to life and helps us build a community where healing, justice, and dignity are honored. Thank you for walking this road with me. My scar is not weakness. It is proof